The morning air in Manhattan was crisp and cold, biting at the skin as snowflakes gently floated from the gray sky. The busy streets of New York City were a sea of movement, people hustling to work, yellow cabs honking through traffic, and the distant hum of the subway beneath the bustling pavement. Despite the chaos, there was a quiet, almost magical quality to this early morning. Snow was blanketing the city, turning its sharp edges into something soft and serene. Donald Trump, wrapped in a thick, dark overcoat, walked through the streets of Manhattan, the cold wind tugging at his coat as he moved with his characteristic confidence. His usual entourage of bodyguards and security personnel followed at a distance, blending in with the crowd. Trump didn't seem to mind. He enjoyed walking through the city, taking in the sights, sounds, and rhythm of the place. It was a city that had shaped him, a city that reflected both his success and his ambitions. He moved past the familiar shops, the towering office buildings, and the flashing billboards. But something was different today. There was an odd stillness in the air, despite the usual New York buzz. He noticed the snowflakes falling, each one delicate yet part of a larger storm. It reminded him of the unpredictability of life, how everything could change in an instant. Trump glanced around, his eyes scanning the streets. He wasn't one to often stray from his usual path, but today he felt an unusual sense of curiosity, an urge to explore the city more intimately. Without thinking much of it, he veered off his usual course and walked toward a narrow alley that he hadn't noticed before. The alley was tucked between two large, imposing buildings, hidden from the usual view of the street. It felt almost as if it was a secret part of the city, an area where time had slowed down. The hustle and bustle of the city seemed to vanish the moment Trump stepped into the alley. Here, the world felt quieter, more personal. There was an old charm about it, with faded brick walls on either side, their surfaces rough and marked by years of wear. The snow had gathered in small piles against the sides of the buildings, and the air seemed even colder, more still. As he walked further into the alley, Trump's steps echoed against the walls, the sound bouncing back at him. He looked up at the sky, where the snowflakes danced in the air. The usual hum of traffic was distant now, muted by the narrow space. His mind began to drift, wondering about the stories hidden in places like these, stories of people who had walked the streets and alleys, of moments that had been forgotten by time. His security team, ever watchful, remained a few steps behind, their eyes scanning the surroundings. But Trump was unfazed. He had always trusted his instincts, and right now, his instincts were telling him there was something worth seeing in this alley, something more than just a quiet corner of the city. He walked deeper into the alley, the crunch of snow beneath his boots filling the silence. His gaze shifted to the end of the alley, where the light from the street lamps cast a yellow glow on the walls, creating long shadows that stretched out like fingers into the space. It was in that moment, as he reached the far end, that he noticed a figure sitting slumped against the wall, a man whose tattered military jacket stood out even in the shadowed alley. The man was hunched over, his posture defeated, his face hidden by the low brim of his hat. Trump paused. There was something about this man that stopped him in his tracks. He could see the signs of hardship written on the man's face, even without knowing his story. His heart had a sense of urgency, an unspoken knowing that this moment was significant, that this man might have a story that needed to be heard. Trump approached cautiously, but his presence was soon noticed by the man, who slowly lifted his head. For a moment their eyes met, Trump's sharp and observant, the man's tired and hollow. It was clear that this wasn't just any stranger. This was someone who had seen too much of life's darker side. The man's face was weathered, and his eyes seemed distant, lost in memories that clearly weighed on him. There was a sadness in his expression, a resignation that Trump had seen before, but never in this context. Trump took a deep breath. his usual bravado replaced by a quiet curiosity. "Hey there," Trump said, his voice cutting through the cold air, softer than usual. "You doing all right?" The man looked up slowly, his gaze meeting Trump's. For a moment, there was silence. The man's lips barely parted before he rasped, "Yeah, just taking a break." But the words were hollow, like a response that came out of habit, not sincerity. Trump didn't move. He could tell that the man's response wasn't the full story. "What's your name?" Trump asked, trying to engage him. The man hesitated. For a few seconds, he looked like he might not respond. But then, with a deep sigh, he said, "Jack. Jack Miller." His voice was rough, like it had been worn down by years of hardship. Trump raised an eyebrow. "Jack Miller, what are you doing out here?" he asked, sensing there was more to the story than just a man down on his luck. Jack looked away, his gaze shifting to the ground as if the memories were too much to bear. "I used to be somebody," he muttered. "Once fought for my country. Now I'm just another forgotten face." Trump could hear the pain in his words, the raw emotion that Jack had yet to express fully. There was something tragic in his tone, something that struck a chord deep within Trump. It wasn't just the words that mattered. It was the man himself, the lost soldier, forgotten by the world he had once defended. Trump didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there for a moment, taking in Jack's words, understanding that there was more beneath the surface. The silence between them was not awkward, but filled with a deep recognition. Trump had seen men like Jack before, men who had sacrificed everything for their country, only to return to find they were invisible, their pain ignored. Trump took a step closer, his expression softening. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Jack nodded slowly. "Yeah, you could say that." Trump's gaze hardened with determination. "You're not forgotten, Jack. Not by me. And not by the country you served." There was something in his voice now. A promise. A promise that Jack wasn't just another lost soul. Trump wasn't going to let him stay in the shadows. Jack looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and curiosity. "What do you mean?" Trump smiled slightly, but there was a weight in his words. "Let me help you." In the dimly lit alley, the cold air seemed to hang heavier, as if the space itself absorbed the weight of Jack Miller's past. The early morning light from the street lamps barely filtered through the alley's narrow opening, casting faint shadows on the cold stone walls. Jack remained slumped against the wall, his tattered military jacket hugging his thin frame, the once proud patches of honor now faded and worn. His eyes, hollow and tired, seemed to carry the heavy burden of years of struggle, both on the battlefield and off it. Trump stood still for a moment, his gaze fixed on Jack. The contrast between the man's beaten-down posture and the polished, powerful image of Trump couldn't have been more stark. Yet something about Jack's presence, the pain in his eyes, stirred something deep inside Trump. He knew this wasn't just another homeless man or a veteran down on his luck. This was someone who had given everything to his country and was now paying the price in ways no one saw. Trump's security team, standing just a few steps behind, exchanged glances, unsure how to proceed. But Trump motioned for them to stay back, sensing that this moment was about more than just the logistics of keeping him safe. He was meeting a man, a soldier, who had a story to tell, and that story needed to be heard. Trump took a step forward, his footsteps crunching softly in the snow. He lowered himself to the ground beside Jack, sitting down on a nearby crate with a quiet determination. The man didn't flinch or move away, as if he had long since stopped expecting people to offer their time, let alone their attention. "So, Jack," Trump began, his voice firm but not unkind, "tell me your story. What happened to you?" At first, Jack didn't speak. His eyes remained fixed on the ground, as if searching for the right words buried in the frozen pavement beneath him. After a long pause, he let out a deep breath, then slowly raised his head, looking at Trump with a mixture of skepticism and faint curiosity. "Story?" Jack echoed, his voice rough, as though it hadn't been used in a long time. "What story? You want to know how I ended up here? Like a lot of guys, just another casualty of a war that no one remembers. I was in Afghanistan, part of Bravo Company. Fought with some of the bravest men I ever knew. We fought for our lives. For each other." Jack's voice faltered slightly as he spoke, the floodgates of memories opening in a rush. Trump, who had seen his fair share of tough situations, remained silent, letting Jack gather his thoughts. The wind picked up, but Trump didn't mind the cold. His attention entirely focused on Jack. Jack's eyes darkened as he continued. "We were in some hellholes out there. Constantly on the move, constant fighting. You can't even imagine the things we saw. But we fought together, side by side. And for a while that was enough. It was the kind of brotherhood you only get in a place like that. The kind of trust you can't buy. But when you come back home, everything changes." Jack's voice cracked as he spoke the last words, and Trump could hear the pain behind them. Trump leaned in slightly, sensing the depth of Jack's struggle. "Coming back is the hardest part, right?" Trump asked gently. Jack nodded, his gaze distant, as if the alley and the snow around him had faded into a memory of another time. "Yeah," he muttered. "You come back and the world doesn't get it. They don't know what you've been through. They don't understand the scars that don't show. It's like you're invisible, like the people who should be proud of you have forgotten you even existed. I came home, tried to pick up the pieces, lost my job, couldn't fit in. PTSD didn't help. I couldn't hold a damn thing together. And then, just like that, I was out on the streets." Trump listened carefully, his usual charisma and bravado set aside, replaced by a quiet understanding. He had heard about the struggles many veterans faced after returning from war, how the promise of support was often forgotten, and how many of them were left to face their demons alone. But hearing Jack's story firsthand, seeing the raw emotion in his eyes, made it all the more real. The alley around them felt even quieter now. It was as if the city itself had hushed its bustling noise, giving Jack the space to finally speak the words that had been weighing on him for so long. He continued, his voice more steady now, though still filled with sorrow. "I wasn't the only one. Most of the guys I served with, they're all struggling. We lost so many of them over there, but the ones who came back, they came back broken. Some of them are dead now, others just disappeared, and the ones who made it, they're still fighting. But we don't have the help we need. We don't have anyone who cares enough to give a damn." Trump sat silently, absorbing everything Jack was saying. His thoughts raced, and for a moment, it was as if time had stopped. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he also knew that Jack, this man who had served his country, didn't deserve to be forgotten. He had seen enough to know that this wasn't just one veteran's problem. This was a larger issue, one that deserved attention, one that demanded action. Trump looked at Jack, his eyes softening. "You're not forgotten," he said, his voice quiet but filled with sincerity. "You don't deserve to be treated like this. And I'm going to do something about it." Jack looked up, his face a mixture of disbelief and faint hope. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. Trump's response was simple, yet resolute. "I'm going to help you, and I'm going to make sure people hear your story." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city beyond the alley returned, but the connection between them felt unshakable, as if this was the beginning of something that could change everything. Trump stood up, offering his hand to Jack, and for the first time, Jack hesitated before taking it. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it was filled with meaning. Trump turned to his security detail. "Get Jack some help. Find him a place to stay, he instructed. As they left the alley, Trump's mind was already working, planning the next steps. But for Jack, it was just the beginning of a transformation. The man who had been forgotten, abandoned, and ignored was now being seen, his story finally being heard. Jack's voice shook as he began recounting his time in Afghanistan, where he had served with Bravo Company. He spoke of the intense battles they fought, the camaraderie that bonded them like family, and the deep pain that followed each battle. Flashbacks flashed in Jack's mind. He recalled the roar of gunfire, the explosions, and the fear. In those moments, survival was all that mattered. He spoke of his brothers in arms, many of whom gave their lives for the mission, and the haunting memories of those days still lingered in his mind. But it wasn't the battlefield that would become his greatest challenge. It was returning home. Jack shared how the transition to civilian life was a fight of its own. He lost his job. He was isolated, haunted by PTSD. The country he had fought for had forgotten him. "I came back and no one even knew who I was," Jack said, his voice filled with bitterness. Trump listened intently, his usual bravado replaced by a genuine concern. There was no boasting, no political posturing, just two men, one with a story of sacrifice and the other trying to understand what had been lost. Moved by Jack's story, Trump leaned forward, his voice softer than usual. "You don't deserve this," he said firmly. "Let me help you." At first, Jack was hesitant. He had learned not to trust easily, especially after feeling abandoned for so long. But there was something in Trump's tone, something sincere that Jack couldn't ignore. Trump didn't wait. He immediately arranged for Jack to stay in a modest hotel nearby, offering him the space to rest and recover. Over the next few days, Trump and Jack spoke often. Their conversations weren't just about Jack's past, but about the future, about how they could help others who had been forgotten. Jack spoke proudly of Bravo Company, but his heart was heavy with sorrow. Many of his comrades were still struggling, some even worse than he was. Trump was inspired by Jack's resilience. "I want to honor not just you, Jack, but every man and woman who served with you. Bravo Company will not be forgotten." Plans were quickly set in motion for a special ceremony at the White House. Trump's team reached out to the surviving members of Bravo Company, convincing them to attend. As the days passed, Jack began to transform. He regained a sense of purpose, a feeling he thought had been lost forever. Trump's words echoed in his mind. "People need to know what you've been through, not just for you, but for every veteran who feels forgotten." The day of the ceremony arrived. The grand hall of the White House was filled with veterans, officials, and dignitaries. Jack, now wearing a new suit provided by Trump, entered the hall nervously. As he walked to his seat, he was met with nods of respect and quiet salutes from those who had heard his story. The room was filled with admiration, but Jack was still unsure. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. Trump took the stage with a steady presence. His voice filled the hall as he spoke of the bravery and sacrifices of Bravo Company. "Heroes are not defined by the battles they fight, but by the courage they carry, even when no one is watching," Trump said, his voice strong and unwavering. Jack was then called to the stage. As he walked forward, he was met with applause. The Medal of Honor was placed around his neck, but Jack's acceptance wasn't just for him. It was for all the soldiers who had been left behind, for every man and woman who had served and struggled in silence. With tears in his eyes, Jack spoke into the microphone. "I accept this not for myself, but for every soldier who has ever felt forgotten." The ceremony was more than just recognition. It was the beginning of a new life for Jack. Over the next few months, he began speaking at events, sharing his story with others. He became a passionate advocate for veteran support programs, and his words struck a chord with many. Trump's faith in him had reignited the spark Jack thought had been extinguished. Each speech Jack delivered was met with standing ovations, and he became a symbol of resilience, hope, and redemption. His transformation was remarkable. He went from being a broken man in an alley to a beacon of strength for others. The climax of Jack's journey came at the National Veterans Honor Gala. The event was held in a grand ballroom filled with influential figures from across the country. As Jack stood on the brightly lit stage before the packed audience, he took a deep breath and began his most powerful speech yet. "The fight doesn't end when the guns go silent," Jack said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It continues in the quiet moments, in the struggle to find meaning again." His words resonated deeply with the audience. As he spoke, the room erupted in applause, with people rising to their feet in admiration. Among the audience was Trump, seated in the front row, watching proudly. He had seen Jack's transformation and knew the man before him was no longer the one who had stumbled through life in despair. Jack had become a symbol of resilience and hope. As the story came to a close, Jack stood tall. The camera followed him as he walked confidently onto another stage, ready to share his journey with a new crowd. The narration played in the background. From the depths of despair to the heights of recognition, Jack's journey reminds us all of the strength within. The screen faded to black, leaving the words, "Dedicated to all veterans who continue to fight battles unseen. You are not forgotten."